Let's get started. Story number 1.
Fishing had always been my way to escape. Growing up in a small town by the lake, my father took me out to fish as soon as I was old enough to hold a rod. The quiet mornings on the water, the cool mist rising from the surface, and the rhythmic sound of the water lapping against the boat gave me a sense of peace like no other. Those mornings were my solace, a time when the world seemed to slow down and everything felt right. But one trip changed my perception of everything, and no amount of fishing could ever restore that peace. It was late autumn when I decided to go on my own. I'd been fishing for years, but there was a lake that had always intrigued me. It wasn't the biggest or the most famous, but there was a reputation surrounding it that stuck with me. It was known as Cold Hollow, an isolated lake deep in the forest, cut off from most of the outside world. It wasn't easily accessible, which kept most anglers away. But I had heard the stories, people who'd gone there and disappeared, rumors of strange things lurking in the deep waters, and a general sense of unease whenever anyone mentioned the lake. I didn't put much stock in it. Superstition, I thought. Fishermen had always been known for tall tales, but something about the name stuck with me. I knew one day I would go. One crisp morning, I packed up my truck, grabbed my gear, and set off for the lake. I had the whole day to myself, and I was determined to see if the rumors were true. It took me a few hours to reach the spot. Narrow, winding roads with trees thick on either side, and the sun barely peeking through the branches. The air was crisp and smelled of pine, a perfect day for fishing. As I neared the lake, I parked my truck at the edge of a small, barely visible trail that led down to the water. The walk to the lake felt longer than it should have. The trees grew denser the further I walked, and soon I found myself surrounded by nothing but thick woods. It was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent. The only noise I could hear was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional creak of a branch in the wind. When I finally reached the water's edge, it was like stepping into another world. The lake was larger than I expected, but the surface was so still it looked like glass. The water was dark, almost black, and it seemed to absorb all the light. A heavy mist hung just above it, making it look even more foreboding. I set up my gear quickly, trying to shake off the strange feeling that was creeping into my mind. The air was still and cold, and the silence was overwhelming. I cast my line into the water, trying to focus on the task at hand. I told myself it was just another fishing trip, just another quiet morning on the water. But something was off. The longer I sat there, the more uncomfortable I became. There was a tension in the air, as if the lake itself was watching me, waiting. The surface of the water remained perfectly still, except for the occasional ripple when a fish swam near my bait. But it wasn't the fish that made me nervous, it was the silence, the absolute, unnatural silence. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the occasional breeze that whispered through the trees and the low hum of the wind. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was easy to convince myself that there was nothing to fear. But as the hours passed, the feeling grew stronger. Around noon, I decided to take a break. I pulled my gear in and leaned back against the trunk of a large oak tree that stood nearby. I pulled out my thermos, took a swig of coffee, and looked out across the water. The mist had grown thicker, and I could barely make out the other side of the lake. The air was getting colder, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if something was stirring beneath the surface, something that didn't belong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until the sun began to set that I saw something strange, a shadow moving across the water. At first, I thought it was just the mist shifting, but then I realized it wasn't. The shadow was too large to be just a trick of the light. It seemed to be swimming, moving slowly beneath the surface of the lake, as if it were stalking something. I stood up, my heart beginning to race, unsure of what I was seeing. The water was still, almost too still, and yet that shadow kept moving, gradually getting closer. I grabbed my rod and cast my line back out into the water, but I was no longer focused on fishing. My eyes kept darting back to the place where the shadow had been. It was gone now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just below the surface, waiting. The minutes stretched into hours, and the sun sank lower in the sky. The lake grew darker and the chill in the air deepened. I had a sudden urge to leave, to get back to the truck and drive away from that place, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something kept me rooted to the spot, as if the lake itself had a grip on me. That's when it happened. The sound was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but as I listened, it grew louder, a slow, rhythmic splashing like something large moving through the water. My pulse quickened. I glanced over the edge of the boat, but I couldn't see anything. The water was too dark, the mist too thick, but I knew something was there. And then I saw it. A massive shape rose up from the depths, breaking through the surface of the water. My eyes widened in disbelief as I saw the shape of something enormous, its form shifting and undulating beneath the surface. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. It was dark, almost shadow-like, and it moved with an unnatural grace. I froze, unable to look away. The creature, or whatever it was, moved slowly at first, circling my boat, the water splashing around it as it came closer. I could hear it now, the heavy breathing, the low growls that seemed to vibrate through the air. My heart was pounding in my chest as I fumbled for the oars, desperate to get away. But the boat wouldn't move. It was as if something was holding me in place, trapping me in the middle of the lake. The creature rose closer, its massive body emerging from the water, and I could see its eyes, two dark, glowing orbs that seemed to pierce through the mist. It was studying me, watching me, and I could feel its gaze like a weight on my chest. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The creature circled the boat once more before it sank back beneath the surface, leaving nothing but ripples behind. For several moments, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. When I finally managed to regain control of myself, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the oars and paddled furiously toward the shore. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely hold on to them, but I didn't care. I had to get away. The lake was not a place for me, not anymore. As I reached the shore and scrambled up the bank, I looked back one last time. The lake was still, the mist rolling across the surface, but I knew better. I knew something was down there, something that didn't belong. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for me to arrive. I never went back to Cold Hollow. I've heard rumors about the lake, people who have gone missing, never to return, and those who claim to have seen things in the water. But I don't need to hear any more stories. I know what I saw. And I know that some places, no matter how beautiful, hold secrets that are best left undisturbed. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a weekend retreat with my brother Rick to escape the chaos of city life. We'd been planning this trip for months, a secluded cabin by a small lake in the woods, far from civilization. Just us, a few fishing rods, and a cooler full of beer. Nothing fancy, but that's the thing about these types of trips, isn't it? The simplicity of it all. You think you know what's coming, but nature always has a way of throwing you off course. Rick and I arrived at the cabin on Friday afternoon. The air was cool, the sky overcast, but it didn't bother us. The place looked like it had been around for decades, nestled among towering pines. The wood siding was weathered and the front porch creaked under our feet as we unloaded our gear. We tossed our bags inside and set up for a night of fishing, just as we'd planned. The lake was a short walk down a dirt path. When we reached the shore, we were greeted by an eerie calm. The water was still, like a mirror, reflecting the gray sky. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. We unpacked our rods, baited our hooks, and cast our lines into the water. Rick cracked open a beer and leaned back against a tree while I concentrated on the water, waiting for a bite. It was quiet at first, at just the sound of our rods swaying in the wind and the occasional splash from a fish breaking the surface. But soon, the quiet became oppressive. The longer we sat there, the more I felt like we were being watched. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, like eyes were on us from somewhere in the woods. I looked around, but the trees were too dense to see much further than the shoreline. Hey, Rick, I said, trying to break the silence. You ever get that feeling like you're being watched? Rick didn't respond at first, just took another sip of his beer and stared out at the water. Then, without looking at me, he muttered, "Yeah, I've felt it. It's just the woods, man. It does that to you." I wasn't so sure. There was something about the place that felt off. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the trees seemed to close in around us as if the forest itself was alive. But I shrugged it off. It was probably just my imagination, nothing more. As the day turned into evening, we decided to head back to the cabin. The temperature had dropped, and the sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. We walked back up the path in silence, but I could feel the unease building inside me. Something wasn't right about this place. That night, we cooked up some dinner and cracked open a couple more beers. The cabin was cozy enough, though it felt old, like it had been abandoned for a long time before being reopened. We made jokes and talked about old times, but my mind kept drifting back to the lake. The feeling of being watched lingered, and I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. Around midnight, after a few too many beers, we decided to go back to the lake. The thought of fishing under the stars seemed appealing, and I figured a little nighttime fishing would help clear my head. Rick was all for it, so we grabbed our rods and headed out once again, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The walk was eerie. The woods at night were alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, but there was also an oppressive silence between the noises. The wind had picked up, and the trees creaked in the breeze. When we finally reached the water, we cast our lines out into the blackness, the only light coming from the dim glow of our flashlights. For a while, it was peaceful, the kind of quiet you can only get in the wilderness. The water rippled gently in the moonlight, and the air was cool against my skin. But as time passed, that familiar unease returned. It was subtle at first, a slight movement in the shadows, a rustle of branches, but I couldn't ignore it. Something was moving in the woods. "Rick," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you hear that?" He didn't respond, but I saw him glance toward the tree line. His expression shifted, and I could see the same unease creeping into his eyes. "I heard it too," he said, his voice barely a whisper. We sat in silence, listening. There was something out there, moving in the dark. At first, it sounded like a small animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then it grew louder. The sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Too loud, too heavy for any animal I'd ever encountered. I looked at Rick, and his face had gone pale. "Let's go back to the cabin," he said, standing up quickly. "Now." I didn't argue. I grabbed my rod and followed him up the path, heart pounding in my chest. The sound of footsteps followed us, but we couldn't see anything. I turned to look over my shoulder, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the reach of our flashlights. It felt like we were being stalked, like something was following us, just out of sight. We made it back to the cabin without incident, but the feeling of dread lingered. We locked the doors and windows, something neither of us had thought to do earlier, and sat in silence. The weight of the night pressed down on us, and I could feel my pulse racing. We didn't speak for a long time, both of us lost in our own thoughts, but neither of us dared to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate, like someone was walking around the cabin. I heard the crunch of gravel underfoot, the scrape of branches against the wood, and the faint sound of breathing. I glanced over at Rick, and his eyes were wide with fear. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. The forest was still, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves. We moved around the cabin, shining our lights into the trees, but there was nothing there. We checked the perimeter and found no signs of anyone. No footprints, no broken branches. It was as if whatever had been out there had vanished without a trace. We stood there for a long time, our breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to make sense of it. I was about to suggest we call it a night when Rick suddenly froze. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm, and he pointed to the ground. "Look." There, in the dirt, were footprints. Large, deep prints, as if something heavy had been walking around the cabin. But they weren't human. The toes were elongated, too long to belong to any person, and the shape of the foot was unlike anything I had ever seen. They led from the edge of the trees right up to the door, and then disappeared into the woods. The blood drained from my face. My heart pounded in my chest, and I suddenly realized what I had been feeling all night. The thing we had been waiting for, the thing we had been running from, was out there. and it was getting closer. We retreated back into the cabin and locked the door behind us, but the feeling of dread was suffocating. We could hear something moving outside, but it never got close enough for us to see. Every once in a while, we would hear a faint whisper on the wind, like a voice calling our names. But when we turned around, there was nothing there. We sat in the dark for hours, too terrified to sleep, listening to the sounds outside. The hours passed like days, and just as the first light of dawn began to break, the sounds stopped. The forest fell completely silent. I don't know what we saw that night or what was out there. But the next morning, when we packed up and left, we made sure to leave the cabin behind. We didn't look back. Story the end.
Story number 3.
There was a time when fishing was the most peaceful activity I could think of. It was the kind of thing that allowed me to forget about the daily grind, to get away from it all, and immerse myself in the quietude of nature. But the summer I spent on Lake Elmsworth changed that perception forever. It started as a simple weekend trip. My buddy Jake and I had been talking about it for months, just a couple of guys hitting the water for a few days to fish, relax, and catch up. Jake was always the one pushing for the adventure side of things. "Come on, man, you need a break," he said. "Elmsworth is perfect this time of year." Lake Elmsworth wasn't too far from where we lived, a few hours upstate. It was known for its clear, pristine waters and large fish, mostly bass, pike, and some decent-sized catfish. It was the perfect place to escape to when life got a little too chaotic. And to be honest, it sounded like the kind of trip I needed. We rented a small cabin on the edge of the lake, far away from the town. The cabin itself was rustic, made of logs with a stone fireplace and a small dock extending into the water. It was a place where you could disappear for a while, just you and the water. We stocked up on supplies, bought a couple of fishing rods, and packed enough beer to last the entire weekend. The first day was exactly what we expected. Perfect. We spent the afternoon in the boat, casting our lines out into the water and swapping stories. There were a few quiet moments, but that was part of the charm. The sun set over the water, painting the sky in reds and oranges, and we pulled the boat back to the dock, feeling accomplished. That evening, we cooked up our catch on the grill, sat outside on the porch, and talked late into the night, the sounds of the lake filling the air. But even then, I noticed something a little off. It wasn't much, just a sense that the lake was unusually still, too quiet. The water was calm, unnervingly so. No animals, no birds, no distant calls, the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was missing. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too content to be out there to pay much attention. The next day, we went out early to get a good spot on the water before the boat traffic picked up. We found a secluded inlet, surrounded by thick trees and rocks. The fish were biting. Jake pulled in a few bass, I caught a couple of nice pike, and everything felt perfect. But as the afternoon wore on, something changed. The air grew heavier, the sky overcast with dark clouds rolling in. A strange unease crept over me, and it was getting harder to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I noticed that the fish weren't as active as before. It wasn't just that the bites slowed down. It was that the water felt wrong. It was unnaturally still. And then I heard it, a splash. Not a normal splash, but something much bigger. It came from the far side of the inlet where the water was deep and dark, just beyond the reach of our fishing lines. I turned quickly, trying to make sense of what I had heard, but there was nothing. No ripples, no movement. "Did you hear that?" I asked Jake, who was busy with his rod, reeling in another fish. "Hear what?" he asked, absently, still focused on the water. "Something splashed." "Over there," I said, pointing toward the deeper part of the inlet. I felt my heart rate pick up a little. Jake squinted at the water. "Nah, I didn't hear anything. Probably just a big fish jumping. The water here can be pretty weird sometimes." But I wasn't convinced. I didn't like how quiet everything had become, how the water looked like a mirror, unnaturally still, even though the wind was picking up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We continued fishing, but I couldn't stop looking at the spot where the splash had come from. It felt like the water was pulling me toward it, like something in the depths was waiting. I knew it was irrational, but the thought stuck with me. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, we decided to head back to the cabin. We loaded up the boat and started the engine, but as we made our way back, the feeling of unease didn't go away. It was as if the lake itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the water following us, but there was nothing. Just the darkening expanse of the lake. That night, we sat on the porch again, drinking and talking. The air was thick, and the lake reflected the lights of the cabin like black glass. But again, the same strange silence hung in the air. Not even the usual sounds of crickets or frogs could be heard. You ever get the feeling like the water's watching you? I asked, half joking, but my voice wavered just a little. Jake laughed, but it was forced. What? Like it's alive or something? I don't know, I said, feeling ridiculous. Maybe, just feels off. Jake raised an eyebrow, but didn't press it. It's just your imagination, man. You've been cooped up in the office too long. I nodded, trying to shake the feeling, but it stayed with me. We turned in early, both of us too tired to stay awake, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing small noises outside, twigs snapping, the faint hum of wind through the trees, but the lake remained unnervingly silent. I couldn't help but feel that something was out there, something watching us from just beyond the waterline. The next day, things took a turn. We were out on the lake again, heading toward a different spot we'd scoped out the day before. The weather had turned even worse. Clouds had gathered overhead, and the wind had picked up, making the water rougher than it had been in days. The boat rocked as we made our way through the choppy water, the motor humming loudly in the silence. We had just reached the new spot when I heard the sound again. A splash. But this time it wasn't distant. It was close, really close. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The water had gone still, and I couldn't see anything. Nothing was out of place. I looked over at Jake, but he didn't seem to have noticed. He was busy adjusting his rod, his back to me. Jake, I called out, my voice tight. Did you hear that? Hear what? He asked without turning around. I'm trying to get this damn line right. I stood up, scanning the water. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was beneath us, something huge. Then I saw it. A shape rising from the water. At first I thought it was a log or a piece of debris, but then it became clear. It was moving. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the dark shape emerge, the water dripping from it like it had just surfaced from the depths. Jake, I yelled, but my voice broke as I pointed. Look. Jake turned around, his face going pale as he followed my gaze. But whatever it was, it didn't last long. The shape submerged quickly, vanishing below the surface with barely a ripple. We both stood there in stunned silence, staring at the water, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The lake went still again, as if nothing had ever happened, but we both knew something had. Without a word, we turned the boat around and headed back to the dock. We didn't speak on the way back, both of us too shaken to even think straight. When we finally got the boat back to the dock and tied it off, we didn't even take our gear. We just packed up and left, not bothering to look back at the water. We never spoke about it again, and I never went fishing at Lake Elmsworth again. I don't think I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was early summer when Jason and Mark, two avid fishermen from a quiet town nestled by a lake in the mountains, decided to go on a trip to a remote part of the wilderness. They had been planning the outing for weeks, excited for a weekend of fishing, hiking, and breaking away from their usual routines. The lake, known as Black Hollow, was renowned for its deep waters and rare fish, a place that only seasoned anglers dared to explore. The surrounding forest was thick, untamed, and rarely visited, which added an air of mystery to the location. They packed their gear, tents, rods, lures, and provisions, and set out early in the morning. The drive to the lake was long, winding through forested roads and rocky trails. As they neared their destination, the trees grew denser, casting shadows over the path. The air grew cooler, and the birds seemed to fall silent. Jason, who had been to the lake once before, warned Mark about the isolation of the place. It wasn't unusual for people to get lost, and the weather could turn without warning. After a few hours of driving, they reached the trailhead and unloaded their gear. The hike to the lake took another 2 hours, and by the time they arrived, it was late afternoon. Black Hollow was everything Jason had described and more. An eerie, silent body of water surrounded by steep cliffs and dense trees. The lake was incredibly still, its dark waters barely disturbed by the occasional breeze, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like the lake was holding its breath, waiting. They set up camp near the shore, the ground soft and damp from the cool mist that rolled in from the lake. The sound of the water lapping against the shore was the only noise that accompanied them. After eating a quick meal, they grabbed their rods and ventured to a small dock that extended out into the water. "Don't expect much," Jason said, casting his line into the lake. "The fish here are tricky. Some say there's something strange about the lake. People have disappeared around here over the years." Mark chuckled, though the mention of disappearances made him uneasy. He had heard rumors about Black Hollow before, stories from locals about strange occurrences, but he never put much stock in them. It was just a place for fishermen, he thought. Nothing more. They fished through the evening, with only silence between them as they focused on their lines. The sun began to set, and the air grew colder. Jason kept glancing at the water, a strange look on his face. Mark noticed it, but didn't say anything. There was something unsettling about the way the lake seemed to swallow the light as the day faded, as if it were alive, drawing everything into its depths. After hours of fishing without much luck, they decided to call it a night. They packed up their rods and returned to camp, the fire crackling as they sat around it, trying to warm their hands. Mark was still uneasy, but Jason dismissed his feelings, offering him another drink. "Relax, man," Jason said, his voice a little too calm. "It's just an old lake with old stories. Nothing to worry about." But as they sat there, the feeling in the air grew heavier. The woods around them were quiet, too quiet. Not a single animal was heard. No rustling leaves, no distant calls, just the oppressive silence of the forest. Jason's gaze lingered on the dark shape of the lake in the distance. His eyes narrowed. "I've heard stories from guys who came here years ago," he said, almost to himself. "They say the fish aren't the only things that live in these waters." Mark looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Jason hesitated. "Some say there are things in the lake, things that people have seen and never spoken about. People who went in and never came back." Mark laughed nervously. "Come on, man. You're not serious?" But Jason didn't laugh. He just stared into the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "No one knows what's really down there. It's not just fish in that lake. It's something else, something ancient." The silence between them stretched as Mark tried to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. He couldn't help but glance at the lake, its dark waters reflecting the pale moonlight, and for a moment he swore he saw something moving beneath the surface. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought, and stood up. "I'm going to take a walk around the lake, get some air." Jason didn't stop him, but as Mark walked toward the shore, he noticed his friend's eyes following him, almost too intently. The air was colder now, and the mist from the lake seemed to be creeping toward the land. Mark could feel his skin prickling, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He reached the edge of the water, staring into the inky depths. There was something mesmerizing about the lake, something that seemed to draw him in, like a pull he couldn't explain. He knelt down, his fingers brushing the surface, and the water rippled, sending shivers up his spine. Suddenly, a movement beneath the water caught his eye. It was quick, like a shadow passing beneath the surface, and it wasn't the movement of a fish. Mark stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. The water was still again, as if nothing had happened. He told himself it was just his imagination, the kind of thing that happens when you're out in the wilderness, isolated and tired. But then he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a low growl, distant yet close, coming from the depths of the lake. His pulse quickened, and he turned around, but the shore was empty. No sign of Jason. He started to walk back toward camp, but the air felt thick, suffocating. It wasn't until he was halfway back that he heard the rustling behind him. His breath hitched, and he spun around, his heart racing. He was alone, but the sound came again. A shuffle, like someone or something, was moving through the trees just beyond his vision. He stood frozen for a moment, listening. Then slowly, he began to walk faster. His instincts screamed at him to move, to get back to camp, but the rustling grew louder, closer. Without thinking, he broke into a run, his footsteps thundering on the forest floor as he made his way back to the firelight. As he reached the camp, he stumbled into the clearing, out of breath, but Jason was still sitting by the fire, looking oddly calm. "You okay?" Jason asked, glancing up at him with an unreadable expression. Mark didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. "I heard something out there," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what it was, but something was following me." Jason's gaze flickered toward the lake, then back to Mark. "It's just the forest, man. This place messes with your head. Maybe it's time we head out of here tomorrow." Mark nodded, though the unease remained. He sat down by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. The night passed in a strange, uneasy silence. The fire crackled, the air thick with tension. And yet, despite their growing discomfort, both men fell into a restless sleep. But neither of them would sleep peacefully. Around midnight, Mark was jolted awake by a sound. It was a low, guttural noise, like something was dragging itself across the ground. His heart skipped a beat as he sat up, his eyes searching the darkness. The fire was low, casting long shadows around the campsite. Jason was still asleep beside him, oblivious to the noise that now seemed to echo through the trees. Mark slowly reached for his flashlight, his breath shallow. He shone the beam into the woods, but saw nothing. Still, the dragging sound continued. Slowly, it drew closer. Mark's hand shook as he aimed the light into the trees, and that's when he saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, something long and twisted, moving through the underbrush with unnatural speed. It was humanoid in shape, but its limbs were far too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its skin was pale, nearly translucent, and its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark, hollow pits. Mark froze, unable to look away. The creature's gaze seemed to pierce through him, as if it could see into his very soul. He could feel the air around him growing colder, the weight of its presence pressing down on him. His body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the trees. Mark didn't wait another second. He shook Jason awake, shouting his name, but Jason didn't respond. He was too still, too silent. Finally, Mark grabbed his friend by the shoulders, shaking him violently. "Jason, we have to go now!" Jason's eyes opened slowly, but there was something wrong with them. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with a vacant, empty stare. "What's happening?" Mark asked, but there was no answer. Jason didn't speak again, and when Mark tried to stand him up, he realized that Jason was too heavy, as if something had drained the life out of him. Mark's panic grew, and in desperation, he grabbed Jason's gear and started dragging him away from the camp, heading toward the forest. But the dragging noise started again, closer this time. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to let them leave. Mark ran, heart pounding, his body on the edge of collapse, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was pulling him back. He didn't stop running until dawn broke, but when he looked back, Jason was no longer with him. He had disappeared. The only trace left behind was the unmistakable sound of something slowly dragging itself back into the water. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a weekend retreat with my brother Rick to escape the chaos of city life. We'd been planning this trip for months, a secluded cabin by a small lake in the woods, far from civilization. Just us, a few fishing rods, and a cooler full of beer. Nothing fancy. But that's the thing about these types of trips, isn't it? The simplicity of it all. You think you know what's coming, but nature always has a way of throwing you off course. Rick and I arrived at the cabin on Friday afternoon. The air was cool, the sky overcast, but it didn't bother us. The place looked like it had been around for decades, nestled among towering pines. The wood siding was weathered, and the front porch creaked under our feet as we unloaded our gear. We tossed our bags inside and set up for a night of fishing, just as we'd planned. The lake was a short walk down a dirt path. When we reached the shore, we were greeted by an eerie calm. The water was still like a mirror, reflecting the gray sky. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. We unpacked our rods, baited our hooks, and cast our lines into the water. Rick cracked open a beer and leaned back against a tree, while I concentrated on the water, waiting for a bite. It was quiet at first, just the sound of our rods swaying in the wind and the occasional splash from a fish breaking the surface. But soon, the quiet became oppressive. The longer we sat there, the more I felt like we were being watched. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, like eyes were on us from somewhere in the woods. I looked around, but the trees were too dense to see much further than the shoreline. "Hey, Rick," I said, trying to break the silence. "You ever get that feeling like you're being watched?" Rick didn't respond at first, just took another sip of his beer and stared out at the water. Then, without looking at me, he muttered, "Yeah, I've felt it. It's just the woods, man. It does that to you." I wasn't so sure. There was something about the place that felt off. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the trees seemed to close in around us as if the forest itself was alive. But I shrugged it off. It was probably just my imagination, nothing more. As the day turned into evening, we decided to head back to the cabin. The temperature had dropped and the sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. We walked back up the path in silence, but I could feel the unease building inside me. Something wasn't right about this place. That night, we cooked up some dinner and cracked open a couple more beers. The cabin was cozy enough, though it felt old, like it had been abandoned for a long time before being reopened. We made jokes and talked about old times, but my mind kept drifting back to the lake. The feeling of being watched lingered, and I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. Around midnight, after a few too many beers, we decided to go back to the lake. The thought of fishing under the stars seemed appealing, and I figured a little nighttime fishing would help clear my head. Rick was all for it, so we grabbed our rods and headed out once again, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The walk was eerie. The woods at night were alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, but there was also an oppressive silence between the noises. The wind had picked up, and the trees creaked in the breeze. When we finally reached the water, we cast our lines out into the blackness, the only light coming from the dim glow of our flashlights. For a while, it was peaceful, the kind of quiet you can only get in the wilderness. The water rippled gently in the moonlight, and the air was cool against my skin. But as time passed, that familiar unease returned. It was subtle at first, a slight movement in the shadows, a rustle of branches, but I couldn't ignore it. Something was moving in the woods. "Rick," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady, "did you hear that?" He didn't respond, but I saw him glance toward the tree line. His expression shifted, and I could see the same unease creeping into his eyes. "I heard it too," he said, his voice barely a whisper. We sat in silence, listening. There was something out there, moving in the dark. At first, it sounded like a small animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then it grew louder, the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Too loud, too heavy for any animal I'd ever encountered. I looked at Rick, and his face had gone pale. "Let's go back to the cabin," he said, standing up quickly. "Now." I didn't argue. I grabbed my rod and followed him up the path, heart pounding in my chest. The sound of footsteps followed us, but we couldn't see anything. I turned to look over my shoulder, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the reach of our flashlights. It felt like we were being stalked, like something was following us, just out of sight. We made it back to the cabin without incident, but the feeling of dread lingered. We locked the doors and windows, something neither of us had thought to do earlier, and sat in silence. The weight of the night pressed down on us, and I could feel my pulse racing. We didn't speak for a long time, both of us lost in our own thoughts, but neither of us dared to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate, like someone was walking around the cabin. I heard the crunch of gravel underfoot, the scrape of branches against the wood, and the faint sound of breathing. I glanced over at Rick, and his eyes were wide with fear. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. The forest was still, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves. We moved around the cabin, shining our lights into the trees, but there was nothing there. We checked the perimeter and found no signs of anyone. No footprints, no broken branches. It was as if whatever had been out there had vanished without a trace. We stood there for a long time, our breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to make sense of it. I was about to suggest we call it a night when Rick suddenly froze. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm, and he pointed to the ground. "Look!" There, in the dirt, were footprints. large, deep prints as if something heavy had been walking around the cabin. But they weren't human. The toes were elongated, too long to belong to any person, and the shape of the foot was unlike anything I had ever seen. They led from the edge of the trees, right up to the door, and then disappeared into the woods. The blood drained from my face, my heart pounded in my chest, and I suddenly realized what I had been feeling all night. The thing we had been waiting for, the thing we had been running from, was out there, and it was getting closer. We retreated back into the cabin and locked the door behind us, but the feeling of dread was suffocating. We could hear something moving outside, but it never got close enough for us to see. Every once in a while, we would hear a faint whisper on the wind, like a voice calling our names. But when we turned around, there was nothing there. We sat in the dark for hours, too terrified to sleep, listening to the sounds outside. The hours passed like days, and just as the first light of dawn began to break, the sounds stopped. The forest fell completely silent. I don't know what we saw that night or what was out there. But the next morning, when we packed up and left, we made sure to leave the cabin behind. We didn't look back. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The lake had no name, at least not one that appeared on any official maps. Locals called it Drowning Deep, a dark stretch of water tucked away in the vast wilderness of northern Minnesota. It wasn't a place tourists visited. It wasn't the kind of lake families gathered around for summer vacations. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of place where the air felt heavier, where even the birds seemed hesitant to make a sound. James and his younger brother, Tom, had been fishing together for years, exploring remote lakes and chasing the biggest catches. James had always been the more adventurous one, eager to push deeper into the wild, while Tom was more cautious, preferring the comfort of well-known waters. But when James heard about Drowning Deep from an old fisherman at a bait shop, how its waters were teeming with massive, untouched fish, he knew they had to go. "You sure about this?" Tom asked as they loaded their canoe onto James's truck. "There's a reason places like this stay hidden." James rolled his eyes. "Come on, man. This is exactly why we do this. No competition, no boats scaring off the fish, just us and the lake. Besides, it's only for a night." Tom sighed but climbed into the passenger seat. He trusted his brother, but something about this trip felt off before it even began. The drive took them deep into the woods where roads turned to trails, and cell service became a distant memory. After nearly an hour of navigating an overgrown path, they finally reached the lake. It was beautiful in a haunting way. Black water stretching between dense pine trees, mist clinging to the surface like a ghostly veil. No docks, no cabins, no signs that anyone had been there in a long time. "This is perfect," James grinned, unloading their gear. Tom wasn't so sure. The air felt wrong, not just quiet, empty. But he kept his mouth shut and helped James push the canoe into the water. They paddled out, the water eerily still, barely a ripple as their canoe cut through. James set up their rods, tossing in the first line. Almost immediately, something yanked it hard. "Holy!" James nearly lost his grip. "That's a big one." Tom watched as his brother wrestled with the unseen fish, the rod bending nearly in half. Then, without warning, the line went slack. "Damn it!" James muttered, reeling in nothing but an empty hook. Tom furrowed his brow. That didn't snap. It just let go. "Fish are smart," James said, tying on another lure. "Let's get another one." But the second cast was the same, an immediate, aggressive pull, followed by nothing. Again and again, their lines were taken, but never a catch. It wasn't normal. Something was playing with them. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in reds and purples. James, stubborn as always, refused to leave without landing something. Tom kept looking over his shoulder, feeling exposed in the open water. It wasn't until the light started fading completely that James sighed. "All right, fine. We'll call it," he grumbled. "But I'm coming back." They paddled toward shore, but the moment their canoe touched land, something in the woods snapped. A branch, big, thick, cracked in half like something heavy had stepped on it. James froze. "You hear that?" Tom nodded, scanning the tree line. The undergrowth was dense, shadows shifting in the breeze. But there was no wind. Another snap. Closer. Tom grabbed the flashlight from his bag and flicked it on, shining it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on nothing. James scoffed. "Probably just a deer." Tom wasn't so sure, but arguing wouldn't help. They dragged their canoe onto shore and set up camp, pitching a small tent near a clearing. The fire crackled, filling the air with the scent of burning wood. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. James sat back, beer in hand. "All right, spill it. You've been acting weird since we got here." Tom poked at the fire with a stick. "It's just this place. It doesn't feel right." James chuckled. "That's just because it's remote. No distractions. It's just us and a splash." Both of them turned toward the lake. The water was still, except for ripples spreading from the center. It was as if something had just surfaced, then sank back down. Tom swallowed hard. "Probably a fish." James nodded, but he didn't look so sure anymore. The fire burned low. The night stretched on. The woods, usually alive with nocturnal sounds, remained silent. Tom barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard something. Soft splashes, distant rustling, the occasional snap of a twig. At some point, exhaustion won out and he drifted off. A wet sound woke him, a slow, deliberate dripping. He blinked, disoriented. The fire was nearly out, casting faint embers onto the ground. James was still asleep beside him, breathing deep and steady. Drip, drip, drip. Tom sat up, ears straining. It was coming from the lake. He turned his head slowly, heart hammering. There, at the water's edge, something stood. A shape, tall, thin, wrong. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but the moment his eyes adjusted, his stomach lurched. It looked human. Almost. But its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in jagged, uneven points. Its skin, slick and dark, glistened in the faint light, and its eyes, black, empty pits, locked onto his. Tom couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His body screamed to wake James, to run, but he was frozen under that terrible gaze. Then the thing tilted its head. Drip, drip, drip. Water dripped from its fingers onto the ground. It took a step forward. Tom finally sucked in a breath, and the thing bolted. Not back into the lake, toward him. He barely had time to react. He threw himself backward, shouting, "James! Get up!" James startled awake just as the creature reached the dying fire. The embers flared, bright, sudden, and in that moment it recoiled, hissing. The smell of burnt flesh filled the air. Then it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Tom scrambled to his feet, chest heaving. James, still groggy, stared at him. "What the hell was that?" Tom didn't answer. He couldn't. He just grabbed James by the arm. "We need to leave. Now." James hesitated. "But now." Something in Tom's voice snapped James into action. They grabbed their gear haphazardly, shoving it into their packs. The canoe, still on shore, was their only way out. As they pushed it into the water, Tom felt it again, that horrible, suffocating feeling. He looked over his shoulder. The thing was standing in the tree line, watching, its head tilted, eyes black voids. They paddled harder than they ever had before. The mist thickened. The lake stretched on, endless in the darkness. Tom didn't dare look back again. He just kept moving, stroke after frantic stroke, until finally, land came into view. They reached the shore just as the first traces of dawn touched the horizon. Only then did Tom look back. The lake was still, empty. James, breathless, turned to him. "What the hell was that?" Tom shook his head. "I don't know, but we're never coming back." James didn't argue. They left everything, tent, supplies, even their bait, piled near the tree line. Neither of them wanted to go back for it. As they climbed into the truck, James muttered, "Maybe some lakes are meant to be left alone." Tom nodded. Neither of them ever spoke about it again. They never returned to Drowning Deep, and neither did anyone else. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I've been fishing all my life. It started as a way to bond with my dad, and over the years, it became a ritual, an escape from the grind of everyday life. I fished in lakes, rivers, and even deep-sea trips, but I always preferred the solitude of freshwater fishing. There's something about the stillness of a lake at dawn, the mist curling off the water, the silence broken only by the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. But there was one trip I wish I had never taken. It was late September, that perfect time when the summer heat fades and the chill of autumn creeps in. My buddy Kevin had been pestering me for weeks to go on a weekend-in fishing trip. He'd found a secluded lake deep in the mountains, a place few people knew about. He claimed it was untouched, that the fish were bigger and more abundant than anywhere else we'd ever been. At first, I wasn't convinced. If a place was that good, why wasn't it well known? But Kevin had a way of talking people into things, and before I knew it, we were loading up his truck with gear, food, and enough beer to last a small army. The drive was long, longer than I expected. We left paved roads behind an hour in, following a winding dirt path that seemed to go on forever. The trees grew denser, swallowing the sunlight, and the air turned cool and damp. After nearly 3 hours of driving, the road abruptly ended at a small clearing. Beyond it, through a thin break in the trees, I saw the lake. It was beautiful. The water was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the sky and surrounding pines. It looked untouched, pristine. There were no cabins, no docks, not even an old fire pit. See? Kevin grinned as he cut the engine. Told you. Paradise. I had to admit, it was impressive. We unloaded our gear and set up camp near the shore. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, and aside from the occasional call of a bird, it was dead silent. That should have been my first warning. We spent the first day fishing, and Kevin hadn't been lying. The fish were huge. Within minutes of casting our lines, we were reeling in bass and trout, each one bigger than the last. It was almost too easy. As the sun dipped below the treetops, we built a fire, cooked our catch, and cracked open a few beers. Kevin was his usual self, laughing and telling exaggerated stories, but I couldn't shake an odd feeling. The silence. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I mentioned it to Kevin, but he just shrugged. Enjoy the peace, man. You're always complaining about city noise. He had a point. But as the night deepened, my unease grew. Around midnight, as we sat watching the fire, a sound broke the stillness. A splash. Not the normal kind, not a fish jumping or a ripple from a breeze. It was loud, deliberate, like something heavy had fallen into the water. Kevin and I exchanged glances. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it across the lake's surface. Nothing. Just the gentle sway of the water. Probably a branch, he muttered, but I saw the tension in his face. We went to bed soon after, but I barely slept. I kept hearing things, soft rustling, faint splashes, always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure if I was imagining them. At some point in the early morning, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of Kevin unzipping his tent. "What are you doing?" I mumbled. "Gotta take a leak." I listened as his footsteps faded into the darkness. The fire had died down to glowing embers, barely lighting the camp. I checked my phone. 4:12 a.m. Then I heard it. A soft, wet slap like something dragging across the ground. I sat up, my pulse hammering. "Kev," I called out. Silence. Then another sound. Not footsteps. Something else. A whispering shuffle, like damp fabric being dragged through the dirt. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent. The cold air hit me instantly. I swung the beam of light toward the trees. Kevin was standing there, just at the edge of the forest. But something was wrong. His back was to me, his posture stiff. He was barefoot, his shoes lying a few feet away in the dirt. "Kev, what the hell, man?" He didn't move. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling. "Dude, you okay?" He turned his head slightly, just enough that I could see his profile. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, but he didn't say a word. Then I noticed something else. His arms. His hands were hanging at his sides, but his fingers were twitching, yet curling and uncurling like he was trying to grasp something that wasn't there. I felt my stomach twist. "Kevin?" His head jerked suddenly, too fast, like a puppet's. His eyes locked onto mine, and he let out a low, strangled breath. Then he bolted into the woods. I froze. For a split second, I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then instinct kicked in, and I took off after him. "Kevin!" I chased him, my flashlight bouncing wildly. He was fast, too fast, his bare feet barely making a sound on the forest floor. I pushed myself harder, branches whipping against my arms, my breath burning in my chest. Then, just as suddenly as he ran, he stopped. I skidded to a halt, nearly falling. He was standing in a small clearing, his back to me again. The smell hit me then. Damp, rotting, like something long dead. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. "Kev, you're scaring the shit out of me, man." He didn't respond. I reached out slowly, my hand shaking, and touched his shoulder. The second my fingers made contact, he convulsed violently. His whole body jerked, his head snapping back with an awful cracking sound. His mouth opened in a silent scream, eyes rolling back. Then something moved behind him. A shape, tall and thin, barely visible in the darkness. Its skin was slick, wet, like it had just crawled out of the lake. Long, bony fingers stretched from behind Kevin, wrapping around his shoulders. I didn't think. I ran. Branches tore at my face, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop until I burst back into camp. I grabbed my keys, jumped into the truck, and fumbled with the ignition. Something was moving behind me. I didn't look. I couldn't. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas, speeding down the dirt road, my tires kicking up rocks and dust. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I called the police the moment I had service. They searched the area, found Kevin's tent, our gear, but no sign of him, just his shoes lying at the edge of the woods. They ruled it an accident, said he must have gotten lost, that the lake was deep and unforgiving. But I know the truth. Kevin didn't drown. Something took him. I never went back, never fished again. But sometimes late at night I dream about that lake. And when I do, I hear the splashing. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The trip was never meant to be anything special. Fishing with my Uncle Roy. He was an old-school outdoorsman, the kind of guy who could track a deer through 3 feet of snow or gut a fish in under a minute. I'd grown up listening to his stories about the places he'd been, the animals he'd hunted, the strange things he'd seen in the wilderness. Most of his tales were amusing, sometimes even inspiring. But there was one he never talked about. I asked him about it once when I was a kid. He just shook his head, eyes fixed on the fire, and muttered, "Some things, boy, they ain't meant to be spoken." I never pushed after that. But when he invited me on this trip, his first real fishing trip in years, I knew there had to be a reason. Uncle Roy didn't do things without a purpose. "Where we going?" I asked as we loaded up his old truck with fishing gear. He grunted, "Out to Blackwater." I stopped, hand frozen on the tackle box. Blackwater Lake was one of those places people didn't talk about much. It sat deep in the woods, a few miles off the main road, with no proper campsites, no rental cabins, nothing. Just trees, water, and a lot of old rumors. "Didn't think you believed in all that superstitious crap," I said, forcing a chuckle. Roy didn't laugh. "Just a lake," he muttered. I knew better than to argue. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sky already bruising with the first hints of dusk. The lake was calm, eerily still, the water black as oil. The trees stood tall and motionless, their thick branches intertwining overhead like skeletal fingers. Something about the place made my skin crawl. We set up camp close to the shore, pitching the tent and getting a fire going. Uncle Roy barely spoke, which was unusual for him. Normally he'd be telling me a story, reminiscing about old times. But tonight, he just sat there, staring into the flames, fingers absently turning a piece of twine. It wasn't until much later, when the fire had burned low, that he finally spoke. "You ever hear about the thing that lives here?" The question caught me off guard. "What thing?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "They don't got a name for it. But the old folks, the ones who lived out here long before the lake had a name, they knew about it, said it ain't natural, said it takes people." I forced a laugh, but it felt hollow. "Come on, Roy, you really believe that?" He didn't answer, just threw another log on the fire and watched the flames climb higher. The next morning, we took the boat out onto the lake. It was a rickety old thing, an aluminum john boat that creaked with every movement. Roy rowed us out to a deep spot near the center where the water was impossibly dark, and we cast our lines. For a while it was peaceful, the kind of quiet you only get in the middle of nowhere. But as I reeled in my third catch, I noticed something odd. No birds. No dragonflies buzzing over the water. No ripples from anything other than our own movements. The lake was silent. Roy must have noticed it too, because his grip on the oars tightened. His eyes kept darting toward the shore, as if expecting to see something. "Let's move," he muttered, reeling in his line. I frowned. "We just got here. We're moving." Something in his tone made me shut up and grab my rod. As I turned to help, something hit the bottom of the boat. Not a gentle bump. Not the soft nudge of a drifting log. A hard thump, like something had slammed into us from below. The boat rocked violently, and I grabbed the sides to steady myself. "What the hell was that?" I asked. Roy didn't answer. His face had gone pale, his hands gripping the oars so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then it happened again. Thump! The boat lurched. The water around us churned, but I still couldn't see anything beneath the surface. Roy was already rowing. Fast. "Don't look down," he barked. That was all he had to say to make me do the exact opposite. I glanced over the side and felt my stomach drop. There was something down there. A shadow, impossibly large, moving beneath us. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't anything I could recognize. It was just there, shifting in the blackness, deeper than it should have been. Then I saw them. Hands. Not human hands. Too long, too thin, fingers tapering into needle-like points. They reached up from the darkness, dozens of them, some barely visible, others close enough that I could see the way their skin wrinkled and sagged. I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could make a sound, the boat jerked again. This time, one side dipped violently, nearly throwing me overboard. Roy shouted something, but I didn't hear him. All I could do was hold on as the water churned violently, the black hands clawing at the boat. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The water stilled. The hands were gone. We reached the shore in record time. I don't even remember how we got out of the boat. All I remember is Roy dragging it onto land, flipping it over as if checking for damage, his hands shaking. What the hell was that? I finally managed to ask. Roy didn't answer. He just stared at the lake, breathing hard. Then he muttered, "I told you we shouldn't have come here." We didn't fish the rest of the day. Roy spent most of it pacing near the fire, his shotgun within arm's reach. I kept waiting for him to explain, to give me some kind of answer, but he never did. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things, soft splashes, whispers that could have been the wind. At one point, I swear I saw something standing near the water's edge, tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, Roy was shaking me awake. "We're leaving," he said. The sky was still dark. The fire had burned out, but the fear in his voice made me scramble to my feet without question. As we packed, I noticed something. Footprints. All around our campsite. But they weren't ours. The prints were too long, too deep, leading from the woods to where Roy had been standing during the night. And they weren't alone. Beside them, half buried in the dirt, were handprints. Long fingers. Too many fingers. We left everything we couldn't carry. Didn't even bother taking the boat. As we pulled away, I glanced one last time at the lake. Something stood at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the mist. Watching. I don't know what we saw that day. I don't want to know. But I never went fishing with Uncle Roy again, and I never went back to Blackwater Lake. Story, the end.